Hi everyone. We wanted to talk to you today about feet in shoes. This is an area that we discuss with a lot of clients during points in our studios because it's something that generally is done quite poorly in the cycling industry, and we see a lot of people with fairly ill-fitting shoes causing sort of numbness, hot spots, blisters, as well as a fairly inefficient pedal strength for some people. So one of the first things that you can do to try and assess your foot and shoe situation is to measure your feet, which is something that a lot of people haven't done since they were buying school shoes. So how we often do this is to look at things like drawing an outline of someone's foot, for example, and then comparing that to the shape of the shoe. So these are two fairly good examples of poorly fitting shoes for clients we have, where the lateral part of the foot here we can see overlaps the outline of the shoe significantly on both, with kind of the fifth and on this one, the fifth and the fourth metatarsal largely sitting outside the area of the shoe. On some shoes that is of course possible, where the shoe can kind of stretch and move, but it's not an ideal scenario because there's going to be a lot of compressive forces from that, and as well this kind of hard carbon area underneath is then not going to be underneath the person's foot, which isn't optimal. So the other thing you can see when we have these kind of shapes is that both of these clients in this scenario have picked a shoe that's too long relative to their foot shape. And they've done that generally to try and find a shoe that's a bit broader, both obviously not quite managing that anyway. But the other problem we have with this extra length is that it makes it difficult to position the cleats appropriately. So the cleat holes underneath the shoe are going to then be too far forward relative to the person's foot, because they're going to be set relative to the shape of the shoe, and the person's foot's a lot further back in that than the shoe would be designed to allow. So that way we're going to end up with the cleats positioned kind of beyond some of the areas in the foot we want, putting too much load on the metatarsal phalangeal joints, and causing a lot of pressure on the nerves and the blood vessels, the muscles in the forefoot. So generally we want the cleat further back than that's going to allow them to do. So not only are they getting the kind of compressive forces laterally on the shoe, but also then the pedal axle position is too far forward relative to their foot. So all kind of compounding to cause big problems. And that's something that isn't necessarily solvable with the components someone has. That's then a case of trying to find a shoe that fits the foot better. So to try and avoid falling into this, that's something that you should really look at when looking at new shoes, is to try and make sure that the shape of the shoe is appropriate for you. It's not just sizing, and as well, sizes themselves are not particularly useful measurements sometimes. So we want to look at sort of the metric value of someone's foot, just measure how long your foot is and measure how long a shoe is. So saying your foot is a 44 and a shoe is a 44 has very little reason behind it, because one shoe in a 44 might be significantly longer than another shoe in a 44. And it's like with all your clothing sizes, for example, that's not transferable between brands. So Lake and Bont that we stock are good examples of this, that the shoes aren't the same lengths for the same size. These two generally, though, with Lake and Bont, are relatively useful brands to consider, because they give us a lot of information on the shape and the size of the shoe. So they give us width measurements for a start, which is one that very few brands actually provide. Some do make a shoe that they say is wider, but they don't tell you how wide that is. Whereas Lake and Bont do give us a metric value of the length as well as a metric value of the width, which then we can compare with the shape of someone's foot. Also then comparing kind of where that width occurs is important as well though. So if someone has a shoe that's kind of the widest point's up here and their foot's at its widest point there, we need to be able to compare those two things. So it's not always an absolute value. We still have to compare the shape as well as those measurements. So once you have a shoe that fits you properly, your cycling should become more comfortable, more efficient, and just generally more enjoyable. So let us know if you have any questions on that, or if any of you want to get some more advice specifically about your feet. Feel free to get in touch.